Hello there. So, preliminary reports just released on Saturday have found that the fuel switches on the Air India flight 171 that crashed just a few weeks ago were cut off. And unfortunately, nobody can explain why this was the case. According to Al Jazeera, so just moments before the fatal Air India crash on June 12th, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner fuel control switches in the cockpit mysteriously moved from run to the cutoff position. An early investigation into the disaster revealed. Flipping to cutoff almost immediately cuts the engines, and the investigations report issued by the Indian Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, or AAIB, earlier on Saturday found that both engines shut down within the space of 1 second, so leading to immediate loss of altitude. So the report doesn't conclude any reasons for the switches moving from. So the report doesn't conclude any reasons as to the switches moving or portion any blame for the Air India flight 171, which had been bound for London Gatwick Airport. Rather, the new details emerged from the report, including a voice recording from the appearing to have compounded the mystery as to what might have caused the crash. So this is what the report has found and what we know about the final minute before the plane crashed. At 13:38 on the afternoon of June 12th, the Dreamliner departed Ahmedabad for London Gatwick with 230 passengers, 10 cabin crew, and 2 pilots on board. Less than 40 seconds later, the aircraft lost both engines during the initial climb. In the first such incident for 787 Dreamliner, the plane crashed into a BJ Medical College hostel and adjoining structures in a densely populated suburb in the city just under a nautical mile, equivalent to about 1.85 kilometers away from the runway. Fire that destroyed parts of 5 buildings, all but one of the people on board of the plane were killed. The sole survivor, Vishwamar Kumar Ramesh, a 40-year-old British national of Indian origin. Some 19 people also on the ground were killed and 67 were injured. So what did the investigations reveal? The AAIB, that's the Indian Aviation Investigation Board, an office under the Indian Ministry of Civil Aviation, is leading the probe into the world's deadliest aviation accident in a decade. The probe is also joined by experts from Boeing and participants from the United States and the United Kingdom. Yeah, because I think also Boeing has to send its investigators. So according to the preliminary reports, the aircraft was deemed airworthy with its airworthiness review certificate valid until May 2026. So it had another year. Routine maintenance had been carried out and no dangerous goods were on board. However, investigations noted that a previous US Federal Aviation Administration of FAA advisory from December 2018 regarding potential flaw in the aircraft fuel control switch system, highlighting the potential of disengagement of the locking feature. Wow. Like, well, first of all, I don't know, like, is that would unless it's a faulty spring and it can. Anyway, we'll look at how that or the fuel switch looks like a little bit later. Let me finish up on the article. So the report on the Air India crash noted that this advisory has been prompted by reports from operators of Boeing 737 aircraft highlighting that fuel control switches had been bound to have been installed with a locking mechanism disengaged. Air India told the investigators that no inspections had been made in response to this advisory since compliance was mandatory. The report noted that the throttle controls module on the aircraft had been replaced in 2019 and again in 2023. However, these replacements were not related to the fuel control switch, and no defects concerning the switch had been reported since 2023. The report highlighted key systems such as ram air turbine or RAT and auxiliary power unit APU were engaged and attempted automatic recovery, but only partial engine relight was achieved before the aircraft crashed. Mm. So it started going down and crashing. So what did they get from the cockpit audio recordings? So the cockpit voice recordings captured one pilot questioning the other, "Why did you cut off?" And the other pilot replied that he hadn't done so. The pilots quickly attempted to The pilots quickly attempted to recover control. The fuel switches were returned to run, and the ram air turbine was deployed, and the APU also auto start. So according to reports, engine 1 began relighting, but engine 2 failed to regain thrust just seconds before impact, and a panicked Mayday, Mayday, Mayday call was transmitted. So here's a second-by-second timeline for the flight. Once at 153 knots, aircraft achieves VR, that's 155 knots. Aircraft picks a transition to cutoff. Engine loses power. RAT deploys to provide energy hydraulics. I think this is the time that if engine 1 fuel switch is returned to run, APU inlet door begins to open, auto starts. Engine 2 fuel switch also moves to run. Pilot transmit Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Final data recorded, aircraft hits the ground. So according to the Saturday's report, the stage of the investigation, there's no need for airline or engine makers to take any action regarding the 787.8 planes or GE-EN1B engines. Further investigation is still underway. So these are the toggles. These are the toggles. I find it interesting that you can actually just cut them off like that. And I would assume that during something like a takeoff, such a mechanism would actually come with a fail-safe. Considering, I mean, it's one of those crucial moments that, like, I would assume fail-safe situations, especially in points of no return. Like if you cut fuel supply when you pretty much need it the most, it's pretty much, how can I say, let's say I'm assuming out of lapse of judgment from the pilot, I would say it would actually end up in disaster either way. So I would assume, or maybe in the future, I'm not an aircraft engineer. I'm just a regular engineer, and I would say that maybe have a fail-safe system on this thing, on this fuel switch. What are they saying on Reuters? So the fuel control switches are equipped with a spring-loaded locking mechanism that keeps them in position and prevents unintended movement. You will have to pull the switch up before moving it from run to cutoff, or vice versa. Okay. So it's not like you can just switch them. You have to pull them up and then cut off. Aviation experts say pilots would not be able to move the fuel switches accidentally. Once moved, the effect will be immediate, cutting off engine power. So fuel is low. So fuel flow, run position. So fuel flow is sent to the engine. Okay, this is locked. Switch unlocked. The switch must be pulled up to unlock the flow movement. Okay, so it goes up, then down. Cut off position. The flow of fuel to the engine is instantly cut off. This is locked with a tab. So the preliminary reports highlighted key events before and after the aircraft took off. All systems were reported to be functioning normally until the moment the aircraft was airborne. What are they saying? So recorded airspeed at 180 knots. The left engine goes cut off. Then 1 second later, fuel engine switch also, the right engine fuel control switch also transitioned from run to cut-off position. The investigation hasn't said how the switch is flipped. The engine power begins to decrease from the takeoff level as fuel supply is cut off. Confusion in the cockpit. One of the pilots had asking why the other cut off, as I've already mentioned. The other one said he didn't do that. So the ram air turbine starts supplying hydraulic power to the aircraft after being deployed immediately after the liftoff. and cut engines off.
Pilot flying will say, let's start the checklist. The pilot monitoring will do the first item, which would be auto throttle, and they'll point to the auto throttle the switch, and they'll say left side or right side, depending on which engine has failed. And then they both concur with that, and they turn it off. Next is the thrust levers. And then the one pilot flying will touch the thrust levers. The other one will say left thrust lever to idle. He'll say idle, and he'll pull it all back. And then it's challenge, response, response. The one will challenge, the other will respond, and the other pilot will respond. There's double confirmation of every procedure that gets done. The final one, and the most important one, is the fuel control lever from run to cutoff. The pilot flying will touch it. The pilot monitoring will confirm it. The pilot flying will then take it from run to cutoff, and that cuts off fuel to the engine. That doesn't get done for 30 to 60 seconds at a minimum when you're doing the procedure properly. Is it possible that one of the engines flamed out and one of the pilots just panicked or inadvertently reached down and grabbed the wrong fuel lever and shut it off? It's anything's a possibility, but that's not part of their training, and it's not something that they would do. And it doesn't explain the Wall Street Journal report that both fuel control levers were placed to the cutoff position. Now, is there ever a situation, standard operating procedure, where both fuel control switches would be placed to cutoff in flight? There is one and one only, and that's called a dual engine failure. That's also on that quick reference checklist. The dual engine failure requires the pilot monitoring to take both fuel control levers and place them to cutoff and then back to run. That's the entire procedure. They don't sit and cut off for a while. It's not like you count to 1, 2, 3 and then put them back. You go right to cut off, right back to run. Now, that procedure obviously was not done. There is never, ever in the history of commercial flight ever been a procedure where you take both fuel cutoff switches and put them to cutoff and leave them there.
Okay, then my question is then why is it left to the absolute responsibility of the pilots in general, considering this seems to be a failure, or this seems to be a point of failure? I would have assumed that maybe this thing would have actually been timed as well, or this cutoff would be timed, in that after a certain time when it's cut off, it actually springs back, so it's up to the pilot to basically confirm and cut it off again. Or it has like a spring that is able to actually bring it back, or an alarm that actually informs the pilot, hey, you need to sort this thing out, or you need to return these things back to on. And they can't stay back at cutoff, considering he's saying, or this is a pilot who's actually saying, Captain Steve is actually saying, so according to Captain Steve, he's saying you have to cut off, then you have to return them, then you return them back on. So I'm saying, just in case you forget them down there, like this situation where they just went cut off, and we're not being told who did so, and both pilots in the cockpit voice recorder were actually asking. One pilot was asking, "Did you cut off?" And the other one was saying, "I did no such thing." So at that point, I don't know, maybe future systems or future manufacturer or future systems will include that, or we'll have to take in flights and actually include, let's say, I don't know, like a spring or a failover system or something like that actually overrides this thing. Because I mean, it's like even autopilot will override some certain things, if I'm not wrong, as far as aviation is concerned, that there's certain places where, or there's certain failover systems. And I would actually assume that leaving something as important as the fuel cutoff lever to pilot's responsibility is, well, I'm 50-50 on that one. I would actually, as an engineer, I would actually have a failover. I'd have a failure mechanism in there that actually returns the switches back on. And if I want to absolutely cut off fuel completely out of from the engines, because of, let's say because of flame out, or both engines were completely destroyed or something like that, I would actually have, like, let's say, I'd add one more procedure to so that I can make sure that it's not something as like as it's not something as easy and so immediate that you can actually, like, a good example, the part where even the other pilot was like, hey, have you done something here? It shouldn't get there. It should have been, by the time this thing is actually off, or by the time this thing goes to off, we know for a fact that, hey, we actually did cut off. Like, who's responsible here? So that it helps in terms of things like troubleshooting or finding out where the disaster came from. Because I think if there was a failover system, it should have actually been deduced to either a mechanical problem with the spring system, or the pilots actually cut the fuel lever, cut the fuel flow off to the engines.
Especially not seconds after rotate. Now, one of the things that's bothered me in this whole scenario from the beginning was how quickly the ram air turbine, or the RAT, deployed. Shortly after takeoff, and I'm talking 4 or 5 seconds after takeoff, that RAT comes out. The RAT is there as a last resort in case there is a dual engine failure. And a dual engine failure normally takes some time to progress. Those big old engines need to spool down. It might take 30 to 60 seconds for them to completely fail to send the message to the RAT to deploy. It's designed to be something that happens at altitude, maybe 35,000 feet. Both engines flame out. They spool down. The RAT then deploys to give you electric, hydraulic. It doesn't give you any thrust, but it gives you enough to fly the airplane and shoot an approach when you get down and talk on it.
So, in simple words, they would have actually been in a much fair or much better advantageous situation if they were a little bit more higher or at a higher altitude. They would have actually managed to survive.
On a radio. Now, that RAT came out almost immediately. Why would that RAT come out so quickly? Because the whole flight didn't last more than 60 seconds. The only explanation is that both of those fuel control levers were placed to cut off. That would immediately deploy the RAT. The RAT now, the airplane is in what's called airborne logic as opposed to ground logic. What's the difference between those two? When the airplane is on the ground and there's weight on the wheels, there's a thing called a weight on wheels switch that tells the airplane it's on the ground. So, for instance, when I get to the gate and I instruct my co-pilot to turn both fuel control switches to cut off, I don't want the RAT to deploy. And it's not going to do that on the ground because the airplane knows that it's on the ground and the RAT will never be needed on the ground. Once I'm airborne and the weight comes off of those wheels, the airplane now reverts to the airborne logic in the computer, and it knows that I'm flying. If both fuel control switches were placed to cut off, maybe I'm doing the dual engine procedure and then going back to run, as soon as I go to cut off, boom, that RAT's going to deploy immediately because the airplane knows I need it. So at that point, when they were placed to cut off, the RAT came out. That explains why and how the RAT came out so quickly after takeoff in a short flight that didn't last even a minute. So that's the what of what happened. There was a dual engine loss. It was due to the fuel control switches being placed to cut off. Now, the next question is going to be, could that have been a mistake? Could that have been done inadvertently? No, the answer is absolutely not. The switches, even though they're called switches, they're not like a light switch. It's not just a simple flip on and flip off switch. All of us have leaned against the light switch at some point and the lights went out and we looked around and we went, oh, sorry, and we put the switch back on. That's not how these work. This is a switch that requires manipulation. You have to grab it with both fingers. It has a detent that holds it into the run position. So let's say we're going from cutoff to run. It's a spring-loaded switch, so we have to grab it, grasp it, pull it out, pull it up, and release it over the detents. That's how it goes to the run position, and then it stays there for the duration of the flight, unless, of course, there's an engine failure and you need to bring it back to the cutoff position. But taking it from run to cutoff is also that same three-step procedure. You have to grasp it, pull it up over the detent, pull it down and release it because it's spring-loaded to the cutoff position. At that point, when it's in the cutoff position, it will command the fuel valves at the engines to close. That'll cut off fuel to the engines, and the engines will then flame out at that point. The only way that that can be done is by a human being grabbing those fuel control switches and placing them in that position. There is no procedure, and there never has been any procedure or any mistake that's possible that those fuel control switches would be placed from run to cutoff just after rotate on an aircraft. There just isn't. So that's the what of it all, and that's basically kind of the how of it all. According to these very reputable sources, that's exactly what happened. So
what are the comments section saying? Yep, there's people talking about, there's this guy who's saying, pilot with more than 15 years of career experience here. Once upon a time, a depressed fellow had privately remarked to me about how he had thoughts of pulling both engine levels to cut off in flight and ending it all. He was immediately and permanently grounded. It's hard to think about it, but suddenly not out of this world. Well, the thing is, I would say there's still investigations are still going on. I would say I think right now there's gonna be a little bit more investigations into the personal lives of the pilots, and also a little bit more on the other 787-8s to see actually if it was a case whereby there's a mechanical issue in it, in the holes, in the lever and the spring, or there is well, as this guy is actually stating here. Oh, there's also another suggestion from one guy who's saying in 2025, it's a little bit interesting that we don't have any cockpit cameras in commercial jets after incidents like the A171, that's the India 171, where a simple overhead camera could have shown whether the pilots touched the fuel cutoff switches. It's ridiculous that we rely only on audio and data. We have CCTVs on buses and trains, but not in a multi-million-dollar flying machine. Makes sense. Time to actually add cockpit video recorders. That would not be such a bad thing, but make it secret. I would say make it secret. And I think also, ever since 9/11, like the aeroplane or inside the cockpit area, that area has become a very, very secretive place. And I think that actually contributed as to why there was not that much freedom and also push towards having a little bit more open scrutiny over that area. Yeah, true. Indeed, even a 480p that overwrites every 30 seconds would be a game changer for most of these cases. I actually agree on that. So that's pretty much my take on the Air India flight 171. I was deeply saddened by that situation, and I hope that the souls that perished during that day, may they rest in peace, and their family also find peace as well. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.